There's a lot of information around CRIS, and so I just wanted to take a moment there to pause for yourselves to really reflect back on to what extent are these dimensions making sense? I mean, how do they resonate with my own views about college readiness? So now that we've talked about the three content dimensions of college readiness, I want to talk about the tri-level structural concept of CRIS. So we believe that for each of these dimensions of college knowledge, tenacity, and academic preparedness, that indicators exist at three levels. At the student level, at the individual or student level, at the setting level, the classroom or the school, and at the system level, the district and or beyond, the local government and the state government. Again, it's really important to stress that the indicators at each level should be actionable and focused on the ultimate goal of getting kids ready for college. So, for example, we're working with a district who has picked disciplinary referrals as a proxy for academic tenacity. And at the individual level, they're looking at who are the students that are getting suspended, who are the students that are getting expelled. And at the setting level, they're looking at aggregate data on these disciplinary referrals. So they're examining which teachers are making these disciplinary referrals and what kinds of referrals are they making. And once they did this, they realized that 85% of the disciplinary referrals were coming from 15% of their teachers in the district. So this example sort of provided the district some information that was actionable. So it prompted leaders at the district level to really analyze what are we doing around disciplinary referrals, how are we training teachers to make appropriate referrals, and what are the supports and interventions that we could maybe use instead of expelling a student or suspending a student. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there are three dimensions of college readiness at three levels, which yields a 3x3 matrix. Can't see really the lines here. And then within each of these cells, we've identified some indicators. And we have a big menu of indicators, but for today's presentation, I've only populated them with one indicator for each cell. We're not advocating for districts to track every single indicator in the menu. We don't think that's sustainable in any way. And we don't intend for this menu to be a one-size-fits-all menu. So we included a variety of indicators so that district can, again, pick the indicators that make the most sense to them. And also, even if two districts pick the same indicator, the way that they act upon that indicator could be very different. So for example, students in one district may be flagged for being off track for college ready if at the end of their 9th grade year, their GPA wasn't 3.0. But in another district, they could be flagged if their GPA wasn't at least a 2.5. So the cutoff points, the thresholds are also important to keep in mind. So let's look at these indicators one by one. So in terms of academic preparedness, again, you have the usual suspects, grade point average, SAT scores, GPA, et cetera. So technically speaking, you can take individual level indicators and then aggregate that data up to look at trends by subgroups within the classroom or the school. So you could look at students' grade point average among subgroups. So maybe you want to understand trends among males or within particular race ethnic groups. And then you can aggregate that up from the classroom or school level to then look at GPA patterns across all the schools in a particular district. So again, just to give you an example, one of the CRIS sites that we're working with has chosen to track students' participation in AP classes as an individual level indicator for academic preparedness. And they have sort of committed to making sure that more Latino students are signing up for AP classes. So this has been a priority for this district for quite some time. So they're able to track, okay, so how many Latino students are signing up for AP classes, and does that vary among our schools in the district? It's also important to note, I show here GPA and then aggregate it up to the classroom or school and then aggregate it up to the district, that some of these indicators are not just aggregated up. There are some standalone indicators. So for example, at the setting level indicator, we have other indicators in the menu that are standalone indicators for setting level indicators for academic preparedness. So that could include, does your school have a consistent grading policy? You can use the school's measures for teacher effectiveness or teacher quality. To what extent does your school make available AP classes to all of your students? So these are some standalone setting level indicators that a district can choose to track. So again, the point of setting level indicators is to sort of monitor what are the conditions that may facilitate or hinder students' readiness for college in the district. And then at the system level, we're really sort of wanting to stress to what extent is the district or the local government or the state government allocating enough resources to help those at the school level and at the classroom level to help kids be more prepared. So again, this district that is following students' participation in AP classes, when they started looking at it across the schools, they realized that a lot of Latino students were not signing up for the AP exams because they didn't have the money. And so this information helped prompt the district to try to understand how can we better support students to go ahead and take the exam and give them the funding and the scholarships to do so. So looking at college knowledge, which again is the knowledge, skills, and behaviors needed to navigate college, in general, you can again aggregate these data up. So here I have FAFSA completion as an individual level indicator, and then you can aggregate up from to the classroom and school, and then across schools within a particular district. And again, there are other standalone setting level indicators for college knowledge. So one of these standalone setting level indicator for college knowledge is, to what extent does your school have have a college going culture? What are the norms and expectations? Do the teachers in the school communicate that college is a possibility for all of their students? Are there college posters? Are there banners? Is there college field trips? To what extent do students have access and information about local colleges and universities? Do they understand what's a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree? How do you apply for a FAFSA? Those can be standalone sort of setting level indicators that districts can track. And again, at the system level, we're really looking at to what extent are there resources being provided to these schools and classrooms to get these kids college ready. And then finally, for tenacity, again, which is the most slippery and most difficult to measure, we're using proxies for academic tenacity, such as attendance and disciplinary referrals. So another standalone setting level indicator for academic tenacity is, to what extent does your school have a consistent disciplinary policies? Are there some students, like special ed students or African American males, who are being disproportionately suspended or expelled from the district? So understanding those data are very, very important. There are other setting level standalone indicators, such as perceived school safety. And to what extent are your teachers practicing classroom practices that promote autonomy? Or are they scaffolding instruction within the classroom? These are some other indicators that are standalone and not just aggregates of individual level indicators. So again, context matters, and we'd like to reiterate the fact that we identify these indicators for college readiness because they're actionable, and we want to have a menu so that districts can customize the indicators that they want to follow. So we encourage districts that we work with to reflect upon what is it in the context of our local district or our local government or our state government that may be facilitating or hindering students' preparedness for college within these 3 dimensions. So with that, I have a couple more discussion questions here to like to take a break. and hear from folks. Are you surprised that certain dimensions or indicators were not included in this CRIS framework? Again, we're just one of many who are working on this issue of college readiness. And what type of opportunities and challenges do you foresee in potentially implementing a system of indicators and support, such as the CRIS? So we can open it up, right, Terry? We can open it up for discussion. Yeah. I heard there's not a shy violet in the room, so. I mean, maybe we can go back. I mean, to what extent do you think these dimensions resonate with your own? Yes?
Well, I have a question about measuring, which is this, you were talking about in the middle level, in the school level.
Yes.
The things that teachers are doing that may or may not be supporting students. And I know we did a little survey, a group of my college students, a survey of other students on their sense of how well they were prepared for their college level English classes when they got there. And one of the pieces they talked about was that their teachers didn't talk to them about what was going to be required in college if they weren't in honors or AP courses. But how do you measure that systematically? You know, and just in general, the attitudes of educators about, you know, I think sometimes I'm surprised at what people will say, and I think, wow, I wouldn't admit that. But I think a lot of cases, the teachers are very sophisticated at when they're talking with other researchers or educators, they're not going to say what they truly believe about the capacity of their children.
Yeah, the whole issue of data use measurement and the data use process is a big one, and I'll talk a lot about some of the initial lessons learned. This idea of CRIS being a systematic thing I think is a very important point. San Francisco, for example, they have a school accountability report card that is available to parents and kids. You can log on to a particular school website, and they're thinking about trying to come up with some of these indicators of college readiness and actually including that. And it could be around these sort of types of practices about information about college and things of that sort. So I think there are some districts that are thinking more systematically about how can we get that information out, but measuring it definitely is a big challenge. Yes, I agree.
So I agree. I was happy to see tenacity, you know, identified, but I guess I'm concerned or question about the measure. It just seems that, particularly the discipline referral piece. So tell me how that's not like measuring academic preparation by measuring the D's and F's. We wouldn't do that.
Right.
It seems to me a measure by the negative is problematic. That there's other pieces that are actionable.
So how would you measure it?
I mean, this is the first time we've heard about it, so understand this is right off the top, but it seems to me that either counselor visits that are related to college is something that is easily measurable. If it's a small school and you don't have counselors per se, then the visits or the conferences that are held about college visits by teachers, presentations that are provided and attended by students would be another actionable piece. Those are more directly related to the measure
of college
than would be this discipline referral that has all sorts of problems to my mind.
Yeah, and like I said, tenacity is one of those very slippery kind of dimension that it's included in the CRIS. But we're trying to sort of, I guess, argue the fact that tenacity is important not just for succeeding in college, but beyond.
I fully agree. I like the fact that you got it noted. I'm just saying, as an indicator, I think it's a problematic.
Yeah.
And indicators are critical for us because the other part that I was going to raise is that the worry that I have is that when we start listing out indicators as a measure, people start to focus on the indicator as an end in itself rather than as what it is, which is simply a proxy for the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And so you have the teaching to the test, well, now have measuring to the proxy.
Right.
And that could become problematic.
Yeah, and that's why I said that we use a sort of faulty measures like attendance as a proxy because we sort of are working under the assumption that if a student is motivated to do well in school, that they're more likely to attend school on a regular basis and follow school rules and stay out of trouble.
And I just think what Ed was saying just sparked with me, you know, sitting with all the people who've worked on NCATE in this row, so we think about knowledge, skills, and dispositions, right? And tenacity, to me, is only one piece of actually the disposition a student's going to need to be successful, because you've got to be persistent, but you've also got to actually, and you've got the college knowledge piece, but the soft skills that we hear that are really critical in the workplace as well as in college, the just understanding how to get yourself and be self-motivated and go to class and be appropriate in class. And there's a lot of, well, it's the hidden curriculum also, especially for our students who are we have so many first-generation students who are coming from small, rural, remote communities into a place that is just truly a bizarre world. And a system, when they're coming into our UA system, that's not necessarily friendly even for those of us who are college, you know, kids who are coming from parents who've gone through the experience. This is still a fairly clunky system.
Yeah, so again, tenacity sort of helps to try to capture those soft skills, right? That motivation, that, again, it's really hard to measure. It's really hard to teach someone to be internally motivated, right? So, but I think the point of it, too, is just to really think about, again, the previous work a lot on college readiness have really just focused on, do students get good grades and do they pass the test scores? What we're trying to argue is trying to be much more holistic in how we seek students being ready for post-secondary rigorous college level work. Because again, a lot of the work seems to have focused on making sure kids that don't drop out or making sure the kids actually graduate, but not getting them ready for a whole entirely different system. Yeah.
I guess my question is Gates stuck on the term?
You would have to ask them, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, these things came from Gates, and they have adopted Conley's definition, and he's done a lot of thinking about college ready, and it's really widely used. And so, we don't necessarily disagree with Gates. We do feel that these dimensions are all very important to track.
And I don't know that you need the perfect term.
Okay.
You know, I don't know if tenacity is the perfect term, but, you know, I'm thinking about it. For years we've talked about, well, we know there's this link between kids that participate in extracurricular activities and those that are successful in life and college and other things, because it does kind of teach them some things that they don't get just from sitting in a classroom.
Right.
But, you know, I'm a school board person, and so, you know, when you look at this kind of from a policy level, the question, I think, kind of comes down to, in my mind, how do you, you know, we're trying to craft dashboards and scorecards and all that jazz, and the really hard thing is figuring out exactly what are the right pieces of data. What are the right things that get at what you want? So that's why it has to be a system of indicators, but you really have to, I guess I'm struggling a little bit with having to, it would be nice to have someone show that there's evidence that these are the right indicators to be looking at for things like tenacity or, you know, or
again,
or even some of the other categories.
Yeah, unfortunately, because we work with such very, very different districts, you know, what's right for one district may not necessarily be right for another. And again, that's the whole point of having a menu of indicators, because the district may already be tracking attendance or may already be tracking disciplinary referrals. But I have to say, again, because the Gardner Center is sort of charged with trying to understand the implementation process, we've been talking to a lot of folks at the district level. And in Dallas, for example, when you talk to a teacher at a school, and maybe this is the case here in Alaska, I'm not really sure, is they have to log onto one system and open it up and get these kinds of data, close that window, then open this system up, get those kinds of data, close that window, and then get these data on like their perceptions of the school climate. And none of those data are linked, right? Those systems don't talk to one another. And it just becomes really inefficient, right? So I think the idea of, okay, yeah, you have to track indicators, and whether or not they're necessarily the right ones may change over time depending on the priorities of the district. But we would like to also emphasize that tracking indicators is just one part of it. You have to link them with supports and interventions. And you have to systematically think about how well are your interventions actually working. Because sometimes folks say, assign them to tutoring, and then that's it. But what happens if tutoring doesn't really work? What do you do? What kind of data do you use to then change course? and then do you come back to it? Yeah.
Well, and it is the consolidation of the data. I mean, it really is how, do you have good dashboards? Things that are going to, and just little things like the use of color, for example, so that when a kid slips into the danger zone, the number
Right.
turns red, you know, so that
Yes.
teachers aren't, because there's just a tidal wave of
Right.
data,
And
and it's how to sift through it.
And, teachers are very, very busy people. They don't have time to look at pages and pages of Excel sheets. So in some places, in some districts, they've assigned data coaches to the schools to be that one person to help make sense of all the data, to work with those teachers. So creating a system of indicators that has these great reports that are accessible is one part of it, but then developing the human capacity to be able to interpret those data and to make meaningful decisions to then link those data with supports, I think it's the whole thing about CRIS is it has to be systematic. Yes?
I'm being persistent back here.
Sorry.
I know I'm way in the back. But as a practitioner, I'm a high school principal. I think to have tenacity or self-efficacy or something in there front and center is critical. Watching so many new to the country, new to the state, new to the city, kids come into our large school, they are tenacious where they're coming from, and it's just a matter of plugging into that grit. If you say grit to a youth, they understand that. To be able to, when they bump up against the rigid school structure, no doubt about it, it's being acculturated. They need to, when they come into our student services office, part of the whole domain there is to help them re-engage with their grit and get beyond this and know that they are successful and they have the power to be successful. And that is what, I'm a first generation college kid. That, and I worked with Dr. Conway down at U of O, it is what all of us know within our souls. That is our self-efficacy mode. That's what keeps us going no matter what. So I love seeing it up there, and I agree that the way that each school or district wants to identify its indicator is going to be full of conundrums of, noise that it's very hard to parse out and get a true indicator that's going to show growth. But I applaud the idea of having that tall, tough Bandura stuff up there.
And we also stress that just because a district chooses a particular indicator doesn't mean they have to just be married to that indicator forever, right? If it doesn't necessarily work within their particular system, they can then choose to follow another indicator. So there's this flexibility within that.
I was just looking that if you Google college readiness and you don't go into the scholarly papers, you get GPA and ACT scores. That's all you get. And so I'm interested in how these messages are communicated to students because they're not reading these scholarly papers. And the feedback that the kids get is their GPA and their ACT score, and there isn't something that looks at some of these more qualitative, esoteric, tenacity type indicators. We need to use them to develop programming, but students need to know them and to understand that relationship to success in college. And I think that that's in the service delivery, but I'm thinking in my organization how many Myers-Briggs tests I've taken and how many times I've been assessed for my leadership qualities and all of those things, and that those types of assessments within this monstrous suite of tests that we give to students really only focus on those academic indicators, and why we don't incorporate more of those into our own school accountability systems.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a lot of schools, though, that are trying to custom make their own type of surveys to understand students' perceptions of the school climate. And oftentimes it gets at those. There is at least one teacher or adult in my school who cares about me, who feels that I will be a success, who notices when I'm not there. And then a lot of principals are using those kinds of data to then change or have conversations with their teachers about the kinds of classroom practices that help promote those kinds of caring and connectedness kinds of important things beyond the SAT, ACT, and grades. So I think there are some efforts, and I think that's, again, these menu of indicators are really just to keep in mind the importance of those kinds of things, and then to maybe, if the school already has a particular indicator that they're using at their setting level, to maybe just go ahead and use that, because that's important to their local context. So I'd like to continue. We have a few more minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about the cycle of inquiry tool. We know someone in Dallas, when I interviewed them, said, we are rich in data, but we're information poor. This is true of a lot of districts across the country. Their teachers and administrators are swimming in data. But are they monitoring and keeping track of these data in a systematic way? So we devised the cycle of inquiry tool, which is really kind of simple on paper, but it's a whole other beast to actually implement in a systematic way. So some of the things that the cycle of inquiry does is to slow everything down, like I said, and it's a systematic process to walk through to think about data. So, for example, data collection. Who's in charge with collecting the data, monitoring it? How often is it collected? When is it available? Where can we access it? Do we have to open this window and that window and this window and that window? Who helps analyze these data? How do we interpret these data? Again, teachers don't necessarily have the time every single day to look at Excel sheets and reports. So what kind of reports are most useful? Is it supposed to be color-coded? Should it come in this form or that form? Decision making. So how do we know when to flag students who are off track? Is it a 2.0 GPA? Is it a week of absences per term? What thresholds and cut points make sense for our students? And then action. So based on the data, who is in charge of making sure that the student is linked with a support? And when are we going to follow up with that? And how do we know if that support is actually working? How are we then going to reassess whether or not that intervention we employed is actually making an effect? So again, simple on paper, but very, very difficult, we've discovered through our work with these districts, to implement and to actually sustain. And we found several challenges. So some challenges include the data use process, again, having multiple systems, not talking to one another, the infrastructure, and not actually understanding in terms of supports and interventions. A lot of teachers don't even know within their own school that X kinds of supports exist. So there are oftentimes duplicate supports existing within one school. So there might be a tutoring service already working with this population and then another one, and they don't actually even work together because one teacher has convinced the principal to sign an MOU with a community-based organization to support students to have this kind of tutoring, while another has talked to the AP, and there hasn't really been a systematic way. So the cycle of inquiry tool really is just meant to be a more intentional and systematic process, and to get the relevant actors involved to think about things more systematically. So understanding the support structure is really important, and I've mentioned a lot of these before, so that you sort of avoid having duplicative supports and inefficiencies within the system. And then also you run the risk of, if you don't know what types of supports and interventions are actually existing within your district, it could be that most of the supports are only for these set of schools, while these set of schools don't have access to those levels of supports. Oftentimes it's because the leadership in those schools have really advocated to try to get all types of supports and services on their campus, but some school leaders may not be as savvy or may not have the same type of community relations as other administrators. So there becomes these sort of inequities in terms of the distribution of supports. So having said this, though, I don't want to make it sound that these districts that we're working with were lacking supports. It's actually the opposite. They had so many supports. They had tutoring, and they had college access providers. They had folks working with African American males. They had folks working with girls, boys and young men of color, et cetera. And so I think that what we're trying to say is we haven't found in our CRIS work in the last couple of years any sort of systematic efforts from the district's part to really analyze what is it that they're offering to their students and how do they know it's actually working. And so I think this is a really key part of the CRIS project, and it's really only this year that we've begun even having this conversation around supports, because in the first 2 years, it's a three-year grant. In the first 2 years, it was really around spending a lot of time on which indicators makes the most sense with us, who's going to participate in the cycle of inquiry, and how are we going to pilot some interventions. It's only now that we've only sort of begin to have this conversation around supports and interventions and their efficacy. So some initial lessons on CRIS. Reflecting back on the last couple of years, like I said, these districts were selected for a few reasons, right? They had some solid technological infrastructure to house the data and to call up data, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've solved all their data use problem. Like I said, they might have a great data warehouse, but then you have to open that window and this window, and these data systems don't talk to each other. The districts also had some infrastructure already in place to communicate and to act. So there were a lot of, to some extent, some cross-departmental buy-in. So in some districts, the accountability and evaluation department doesn't talk to student support services because they think they're just doing assessment. But those evaluators are also very important in terms of trying to understand the efficacy of different programs. So some of these districts were trying to make efforts to have less silos within their districts and to get people within the central office to share data and to participate collaboratively in meetings. So they were all engaged. There was some level of engagement among the stakeholders. So in Pittsburgh, for example, they have the Pittsburgh Promise, which is a scholarship fund for their students who meet certain criteria, and it's being funded by local philanthropy organizations and businesses, so that students, if they meet these criteria of attendance and GPA, that they are then ready for, they can get a scholarship to go to one of the state schools. And so there were a lot of stakeholder engagement. And these districts were also given that in this regime of accountability and focus on test scores and grades, they were also really more open to looking at things like college knowledge. They were really open to looking at things like academic tenacity. So these are some of the lessons that we learned about these districts when we started the CRIS project. And then in implementing it, in implementing this CRIS system, I've touched a lot on the sort of opportunities and challenges that could maybe also be an issue here in Alaska. Here are just some of them that you have to have buy-in. And I think it's important to note that the districts that we're working with have had some pretty severe staff and leadership turnover. They've changed superintendents. The whole district was realigned. There was no money in the budget, and people had to reapply for their jobs, and teachers had to be laid off. And so I think with all of that tumult and turmoil, it always blunt momentum in trying to implement a CRIS indicator system. It's also, again, important to talk really about flexible data systems. I think this issue comes across in a lot of our districts, that data need to be linked, and they need to exist in a centralized system, and teachers need to be able to access reports in meaningful ways, in easy ways, for them to actually make real-time change and to make real-time action. And so, as we close, this is the year 3 of this project, and we don't know what's up with it in the future. We are trying to develop the list of products under the guidance of the Gates Foundation on different products that might be relevant to the field. So things that we're trying to collaborate and create with the Annenberg Institute and with the University of Chicago is an implementation guide. So how would one district in another part of the country help implement this? We've talked to a lot of district superintendents and associate superintendents, and we're going through the data, we're analyzing the interview transcripts, we're coding for themes, and these are some of the big themes that jump out at us. And so I think as we move along and we talk to our partners and talk to the Gates Foundation, we're trying to develop some useful products, not only just for researchers, but also for teachers and other practitioners at the school site. So given that, we've only really just begun thinking about CRIS at the state level. And the way that we've been thinking about it at the Gardner Center is that the state can help provide a vision for college readiness, some concrete guidance, and stress the importance of tracking college readiness. So, for example, the state could help create a vision and advocate for college readiness efforts in districts across the state. They can talk about what is the state's goal for college readiness and when are we supposed to get there? How do these goals then translate to the district level? What mechanisms should district use to report their level of college readiness to the state? And what are the current statistics on college completion among students in that state? What are the contributing factors? So the state can help sort of guide a vision that we're going to get X number of kids ready for college by 2020 or something like that. And they can provide concrete guidance. They can help define college readiness as a multi-dimensional concept. They could help create and support indicator systems that track these data not only at the individual level, but at the setting and at the system level. They could, districts could help engage in collaborative partnerships with post-secondary institutions. So at the Gardner Center, we're working on another project, and I have handouts, actually, there should have been on the table on our project with San Francisco Unified School District. The school district has never shared data with the community college of San Francisco, ever, and for a variety of political reasons. A project that took a long time to actually get those folks to actually share data, to talk about, oftentimes it's like, you're not getting your kids ready to go to college, and it's, finger pointing all the time. So when they actually were able to then share data, we were able to link of the kids that were going to the San Francisco Unified School District, who then went to City College, how well did they do, did they get remediated, were certain kids more likely to be remediated, et cetera. So I think the state could help sort of encourage more data sharing among different systems, the K through 12 system, post-secondary institutions, and maybe even community-based organizations to help, because we're all on the same team, right? We're all working to get kids to be successful and to develop in healthy ways. And so I think that's one way that the state could help provide guidance. And then to stress again to the various districts across the state that tracking college readiness is really important. We could use these data to maybe track systemic inequities within the system. So are there particular race, ethnic populations or socioeconomic groups that are not having the same level of access to information about college or are not going to college in the same sort of rates? And then the state can also help guide districts in terms of standards and rigor. But again, we're not pushing necessarily for accountability, but I think we're just trying to get the state to really think about why would it be important to track college readiness and not just focus on tests and grades, but also on all these other dimensions. And so again, we're only now just starting to think about it at the state level, and I know that's a big part of the conversation today. So I think this is one way that we're thinking about it. So our last set of questions are what relations exist between K through 12 systems and other institutions that would help facilitate college readiness, and in what ways and to what extent are local actors getting and helping students be better prepared? Again, this idea that data sharing among the different youth-serving organizations in one system can help sort of motivate our work and try to guide the work in more sort of directed and meaningful ways. So I will close with those discussion questions and would love to hear from you guys. My voice is going out of it.
And we have a good bit of time for discussion, so please ask whatever questions you might have.
This is not a direct question.
Okay.
But I'm making a connection to what's going on policy-wise in districts. And I think there's an opportunity here to take a look at the new teacher evaluation tool. And in our state, over time, 50% of the evaluation tool will include student learning data. And two pieces of data is required. And one will be the summative assessment, and the other is a district decision. And I'm thinking that if we believe that tenacity or academic behavior is the key to the readiness, how can we measure it in terms of making it part of a teacher's evaluation so that she is explicitly teaching the behaviors needed for being in the classroom, for one, and two, readiness for college? Because if our teachers can connect to what that looks like, then I would think that they would find it meaningful in their own evaluation.
Yeah, we totally agree. Teachers are our biggest investment, right? And without high quality instruction, college readiness doesn't really mean anything, right? So I think that Dallas, for example, is really looking to the extent to which we can use sort of teacher measures to help get at some of these dimensions. And I think the work of CRIS, we don't want CRIS to be yet another district reform, reform du jour. We really sort of want it to be embedded into the system. And so it doesn't matter if a district adopted this and participated in this and called it a CRIS, but really has embedded this idea of college readiness as being multidimensional at 3 levels, and that this is setting up systems of measurement and indicators and data systems to help track these things, and one of which could be through these measures of teacher efficacy or teacher quality. So I think that is a really important point.
One of my observations is you're developing a system and you're doing it for college readiness, but you're really laying the groundwork for a bigger arena that tracks all students, because you also have students who we know are not going to go to college, who need to be career ready, or who need to go into tech. And so I think you're doing the work that lays a system in place that could be expanded to include all students, which will make it more meaningful for districts to buy into.
Yeah, very possibly, yeah.
I was curious, you've got 3 tiers of indicators. You've got the individual, the setting, and the system, but when you talk about supports and actions, they only dealt with that first tier, with the individual. And it seems like you've got these indicators around setting and system. What about actions and supports for issues that those indicators indicate?
Yeah, I think that's a really important issue, because we've sort of been, because of our focus on districts and schools, we focus really those supports and interventions at the student. But you're right. I mean, I think that districts need a lot of supports in order to be able to implement these kinds of systematic processes. So I don't have much to say, actually, about that. I think that's a really important point, given the sort of dire straits of a lot of urban districts with funding cuts, et cetera. Districts have had a lot to have had to do a lot with very little. And so I think because of that, we've sort of really focused more on trying to get to the student rather than a more systematic way of supporting, because the resources really weren't there. So in this, but you're right, I think those kinds of supports are really also important to think about, maybe even at the state level, right?
Well, and even at the school, it takes me back to work that we did with Ed about, and using the data-wise cycle, which is really close
Very
to
similar.
yeah. And there was a point in that cycle where it was, and teachers examined their own practice and looked for what might work better. And what we saw on the ground was that there's a very strong tendency to skip right over that and go right to the student. How can I fix the student so they can cope with what I'm doing, as opposed to how can I change what I'm doing? And I think teachers need a lot of support to
Right.
make that kind of change.
I agree. Yeah.
I think her point was well made when she spoke to the fact that we look at the data and we think it points just to the students, and it really, we really need to be looking at that and owning that data as indicators on the system. And I think your Latino example was exactly right, that we look at that, and if you stop short and say this only points to the students, that means in this example Latino students are not really college prepared. But in actuality, if we look at the system, we say wait a minute, we've got a financial issue. They're not able to take those AP courses because, and so I look at that first question, and in the K-12 system, if we define our role as getting kids to graduate from high school, we probably stop short of where we should be. And if the goal of the university has been, our goal is just to get kids into the university,
Right.
Or even just defining their success as just graduation too, we're falling short. And so largely with the work of ASPRA and these types and CAPER and things, we are really over the last couple of years starting to expand what our role is, what our goals are for the sake of our kids. Our goal doesn't stop here. Graduation isn't, that's the next step. But our goal is not to get kids out the door, it's to have them be prepared and successful and hand them into the next level. So, I'm encouraged by what I see in the last couple of years with President Gamble from the university system here, as well as all the key players, that we're really starting to do this between those systems.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's really, really key. Just for an example, with the work with the San Francisco Unified and the City College of San Francisco, they hadn't shared data and for many, many years for a variety of reasons, and a lot of finger pointing was happening. And so I think once they were both at the table and then we were able to show, okay, well, here are the kids that are going, and being able to have a conversation around those things, that it's sort of really a P through 16 pipeline, you know what I mean? Or even beyond that, right? Post education, because again, like I said in the beginning, this is a conversation about college, career, and life readiness. So I think this is just one part of it.
That's exactly what I was going to pick up on. Because as a system, again, school systems, we are trying to do college, career, and life. This, as you opened with and just repeated, this is the college slice, but one would presume if we're going to have indicators for career readiness, there's some overlap. And anyways, and as a system, we need to not just do one, we've got to do all three. And how, so as an academic, you really have the luxury of being able to hone in on this one, but as systems, we need to prepare ourselves for all three, and and one would presume, I presume, that tenacity will overlap in all three, but exactly how, in terms of career, life, and college readiness. Yeah. So I think as the system where this ends up, we need some help looking at the three and not just doing the sort of pure slice of the one, though it's an important one.
Exactly. I agree.
And also, in terms of your second question, Terry probably talked with you, but I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the ARISE initiative in Anchorage School District, which is really calling it cradle to
career.
Community. It's beyond career, and the idea is that it's a partnership between all the players. So the community is really driving it along with the school district, and so we've been looking at. I'm on the indicators group, no surprise, and we've really been looking at these questions about how you get at measures of well-being, first of all, that are culturally appropriate, but also that really get at those other factors, some of the ones that you were saying are not in the system, but we're saying are, which have to do with the family connectedness with the school and the students' sense of connectedness and support both within the school and again within the community, so that we start breaking down some of the separation and also some of the tough, intractable things that we keep talking about. There's we have the blame game around parents, and so we can set up all these indicators in our schools, but there are some educators who will always say it doesn't matter because the parents are not engaged, the parents are not. So now we're both trying to measure that, because my experience in doing research in the state is parents, a lot of them are very engaged, but find the school such a hostile place to be that they don't engage directly in the school, even though at home and in other circumstances they're really keying in on how important education is. So now, in at least in Anchorage, there is this very holistic approach with a very broad-based group of actors doing this kind of system.
That's really encouraging because, again, like I said at the beginning, a lot of our work is really focused on the central office, you know, and the Annenberg Institute, their focus is sort of like from the district up or out, and ours has been from the district down to the schools, but parents are very, very important. And in our own work at the Gardner Center about family engagement, we did some research on full-service community schools in the Bay Area, and a lot of the way that teachers and administrators and principals were defining family engagement was family engagement on campus, as opposed to actually my mom sits with me and helps me with my homework or reads to me at home. But because those teachers and administrators don't necessarily see those parents who don't have a car, have 3 jobs, et cetera, as not being engaged, it was really interesting when you talk to teachers and school actors that they define family engagement in one way, and then when you talk to parents and students, they define school and family engagement in another way. So I think your point about parents is really, really critical. So with that, I mean, I know that we have a lot of other working groups at the end, and there's coffee and pastries. So really, thank you very much for having us come and to share with you a little bit about our work. And if you'd like to contact me, and then there's some handouts on the table, I'd be more than happy to chat with you. So thank you very much.
So logistically, we are a little ahead of schedule, so that means you get a little bit longer break to talk to each other.